My name is Gabriella, and I am 31 years old. I used to believe that my life was about to become perfect. My wealthy fiancé had finally invited me to meet his parents at their Connecticut estate, and I thought this was the beginning of my fairy tale ending. But on the way there, I stopped to help an elderly woman stranded on a country road. I had no idea that simple act of kindness would reveal a horrifying truth about the family I was about to join. What I discovered inside that mansion changed everything I thought I knew about love, wealth, and the people who claim to care about you. Before I share what happened inside that mansion, let me know where you are watching from today. Please hit that like button and subscribe, because what I am about to tell you will make you question everything you think you know about wealth, family, and the people who claim to love you. Let me take you back to who I was before that fateful day. I work as a social worker at a nonprofit organization in Denver, Colorado. The salary is modest, nothing that would impress anyone at a cocktail party, but the work fills my soul in ways I never knew possible. Every day I help elderly people who have been forgotten by society, homeless individuals looking for a second chance, and families struggling to stay together through impossible circumstances. It is not glamorous work, but it matters. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, the daughter of 2 public school teachers. My parents never had much money, but they had values that they passed down to me. They taught me that kindness costs nothing but means everything. They showed me through their actions that a person's worth has nothing to do with their bank account. Those lessons shaped who I became. After college, I moved to Denver to pursue my passion for helping others. I found a tiny apartment that I could barely afford, filled it with secondhand furniture and plants that somehow survived my neglect, and built a life that was simple but happy. I never imagined that life would intersect with extreme wealth. Then I met Brandon. It happened 2 years ago at a charity gala. My organization had been invited to the event as one of the beneficiaries, and I was there representing our work with the elderly community. I felt completely out of place among all the designer gowns and expensive jewelry. My dress was from a clearance rack, and my shoes pinched my feet because I had borrowed them from a coworker. Brandon approached me near the bar. He was tall, with perfectly styled dark hair and a smile that seemed to light up the entire room. He wore a suit that probably cost more than 3 months of my rent. I expected him to walk right past me to someone more suitable for his obvious wealth. Instead, he stopped and asked what organization I worked for. When I told him about my work with the elderly and homeless, something shifted in his expression. He seemed genuinely interested, asking thoughtful questions about our programs and the people we served. By the end of the conversation, he had asked for my number. I gave it to him, certain he would never actually call. He called the next morning. Our first date was at a restaurant I could never have afforded on my own. Brandon insisted on paying, which made me uncomfortable, but he was so charming about it that I eventually stopped protesting. We talked for hours about everything: our childhoods, our dreams, our fears about the future. He told me about his work as an investment banker and how sometimes the corporate world felt hollow to him. I told him about the families I helped and how sometimes the weight of their struggles kept me up at night. The chemistry between us was undeniable. Brandon was intelligent, charismatic, and seemed genuinely interested in my world, despite how different it was from his. When he kissed me goodnight outside my apartment building, I felt like I was floating. As weeks turned into months, I learned more about Brandon's background. He came from the Ashford family of Connecticut, a name that apparently carried significant weight in certain circles. His father, Richard Ashford, was the CEO of a major real estate development corporation. His mother, Victoria, was a socialite who served on the boards of various charitable organizations. They lived on a sprawling estate that had been in the family for generations. Brandon had grown up with every privilege imaginable: private schools, luxury vacations, a trust fund that would have made my yearly salary look like pocket change. He lived in a penthouse apartment, drove cars that cost more than houses, and wore watches that could have paid off my student loans. The gap between our worlds was enormous. I felt intimidated at first. How could someone like him possibly be interested in someone like me? But Brandon consistently reassured me that my genuineness was exactly what attracted him. He said he was tired of the superficial women in his social circle, tired of relationships based on family connections and financial advantages. He claimed he wanted something real. Looking back now, I can see the red flags I chose to ignore. Brandon rarely talked about his family in detail. When I asked about his grandparents, he would give vague answers. "My mother passed away many years ago," he once said about his grandmother, and then quickly changed the subject. He never showed me family photos beyond the occasional picture of himself with his parents at some formal event. And despite dating for 2 years, he always had a reason why I could not meet his family. His parents were traveling. His father was consumed with business matters. His mother did not like unexpected visitors. There was always an excuse, always a reason to postpone the introduction. I accepted these explanations because I loved him and because I wanted to believe that everything would work out eventually. 6 months before the events of this story, Brandon proposed. We were at a rooftop restaurant with a view of the entire city skyline. He had arranged for the staff to bring out the ring with dessert, a stunning diamond that sparkled under the evening lights. When he got down on one knee and asked me to spend my life with him, I said yes without hesitation. The ring was beautiful, but felt heavy on my finger, not because of its physical weight, but because of what it represented. I was going to marry into a world I did not understand, a world of wealth and privilege and expectations I could barely imagine. But I loved Brandon, and I believed he loved me. The meeting with his parents kept getting postponed even after the engagement. I started to wonder if they even knew about me. When I pressed Brandon about it, he would get uncomfortable and say things like, "They are just very private people," or "they need time to warm up to the idea." The idea of what I wondered. The idea of their son marrying a social worker. Then 2 weeks before the day that changed everything, Brandon called me with news that made my heart race. "My parents want to officially meet you. They are hosting a formal dinner at the estate this Saturday. This is it, Gabriella. They are finally ready." I should have been thrilled. Instead, I felt a knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. Brandon's next words did not help. "Just be yourself," he said. "But maybe dress appropriately. It is a formal dinner." The way he emphasized appropriately made me feel like I was already failing some test I did not know I was taking. But I pushed those feelings aside and focused on preparing for the most important dinner of my life. I spent money I could not really afford on a new dress, something elegant enough for a formal dinner, but not so expensive that I felt like a fraud wearing it. I practiced introducing myself in front of my bathroom mirror, rehearsing talking points about my work and my background. I wanted so badly to make a good impression. Brandon gave me the address of the estate somewhere in the Connecticut countryside, about 4 hours from my apartment. He suggested I drive myself, so I would have my own transportation, which seemed practical at the time. In retrospect, I wonder if he wanted me to have an escape route. He flew back to Connecticut the day before the dinner to help his parents prepare whatever that meant. The night before I was supposed to leave, he texted me one final message. "Cannot wait for you to finally meet everyone. Drive safe." I barely slept that night. On Saturday morning, I woke before dawn, double-checked my overnight bag, and set off on a journey that would change my entire life. The first 3 hours of the drive were uneventful. I listened to podcasts, drank too much gas station coffee, and tried to calm my nerves by reminding myself that Brandon's parents were just people. Wealthy people, yes, but still human beings who presumably wanted their son to be happy. Then my GPS lost signal. I was somewhere in rural Connecticut when the navigation on my phone simply stopped working. One moment I had clear directions to the Ashford estate. The next moment, the screen showed nothing but a blank map with no route highlighted. I pulled over to the side of the narrow country road and tried to refresh the app, but there was no cell service to connect to. The roads out here were nothing like the highways I had traveled earlier. They were narrow and winding, lined with old trees, whose branches created a canopy overhead that blocked much of the sunlight. Houses were few and far between, and the ones I did see were set back from the road behind long driveways. I had no idea if I was even heading in the right direction anymore. I checked the time on my dashboard. If I had stayed on course, I would have had about 90 minutes of buffer before the dinner was scheduled to begin at 6 in the evening. Plenty of time. But now, lost on roads I did not recognize with no GPS and no cell service, that buffer was quickly disappearing. I tried to follow signs toward the general area where I thought the estate should be, but country roads have a way of looping back on themselves that can be disorienting. Every turn seemed to take me deeper into unfamiliar territory. The houses became even more sparse, the trees thicker, the roads narrower. My anxiety was building when I saw her. An old sedan was parked on the shoulder of the road ahead of me, its hazard lights blinking weakly. Standing beside it was an elderly woman, small and fragile-looking, with hair as white as fresh snow. She was waving her hand in a gesture that was clearly meant to flag down passing cars, but her movements were weak, almost desperate. I slowed as I approached. Every instinct from my professional training screamed at me to stop and help. But another voice in my head reminded me that I was already late, that Brandon's parents were waiting, that first impressions were everything. I drove past her, for about 30 seconds. Then I looked in my rearview mirror and saw her slump against the side of her car, her body language speaking of exhaustion and defeat. And I thought about my grandmother who had passed away when I was in college, and how I would have wanted someone to stop for her if she had been stranded and helpless on the side of some lonely road. I pulled a U-turn and drove back. The woman looked up as I approached, her face a mixture of hope and wariness. I parked behind her disabled vehicle and got out of my car, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "Hi there, I saw you needed some help. Are you okay?" She studied me for a moment, her eyes surprisingly sharp for someone who looked so physically frail. She was wearing a simple cotton dress and a cardigan that had probably been expensive once, but was now faded from years of washing. Despite her modest appearance, there was something about the way she carried herself that suggested she had not always lived such a simple life. "My car just stopped running," she said, her voice tired but clear. "I called for a tow truck, but they said it would be at least 3 hours before anyone could get out here. I was trying to walk home, but it is about 2 miles, and I am not sure I can make it." I noticed she was trembling slightly, and her skin had a pallor that concerned me. Years of working with elderly clients had taught me to recognize the signs of dehydration and exhaustion. "When did you last have something to drink?" I asked, slipping into my professional mode almost automatically. She thought about it for a moment. "This morning, I suppose. I was in such a hurry to get to my doctor's appointment that I forgot to bring water. I hurried back to my car and grabbed the water bottle I always kept in my bag. I handed it to her and watched as she drank gratefully, some color returning to her cheeks almost immediately. "Thank you, dear," she said after finishing half the bottle. "That is very kind of you. Most people do not stop anymore. They are all in such a rush to get wherever they are going." I thought about the dinner waiting for me, about Brandon's parents, and the impression I was supposed to make. But looking at this woman clearly in need of help, I could not bring myself to care about any of that. "My name is Gabriella. Please let me drive you home. I cannot leave you out here like this." She hesitated, clearly not wanting to be a burden. "You seem like you are on your way somewhere important," she said, gesturing at my dress and carefully styled hair. "I do not want to make you late. Nothing is more important than making sure you are safe," I said, and I meant it. "Come on, let me help you to my car." Her name was Eleanor. She told me this as I helped her into the passenger seat of my Honda Civic. "I am Eleanor, dear, and I cannot thank you enough for stopping." She gave me directions to her house, which turned out to be about 3 miles down the road in the opposite direction from where I had been heading. As I drove, we talked. Or rather, she asked questions about me, and I found myself opening up to this stranger in a way that surprised me. I told her about Brandon, about the dinner I was supposed to attend, about my nervousness at meeting his wealthy family. "Meeting his parents," Eleanor said thoughtfully. "That is a big step. What kind of family are they?" "Wealthy," I admitted. "Very wealthy. I am nervous, honestly. I come from a completely different background, and I am not sure I will fit in." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, gazing out the window at the passing trees. "Wealth can reveal a person's true character," she said finally, "or hide it completely. Be careful, dear. Not everyone with money has earned the right to be respected." There was something in her voice that made me think she was speaking from personal experience, but I did not want to pry. We arrived at her home a few minutes later. It was a small cottage-style house, modest but well-maintained, with a garden out front that was clearly someone's labor of love. Roses and hydrangeas bloomed in carefully tended beds, and a small porch held 2 rocking chairs that looked like they had seen decades of use. I helped Eleanor inside, insisting on making sure she was settled before I left. The interior of the house was like stepping back in time. The furniture was old but high quality, the kind of pieces that had been built to last generations. Photos lined the walls and sat on every available surface, though I noticed several frames were turned face down. "Please sit for a moment," Eleanor insisted. "Let me make you some tea before you go. It is the least I can do after you have been so kind." I knew I should leave. I was already significantly late, but something about this woman made me want to stay to learn more about her. So I sat in her cozy living room and accepted a cup of tea that she prepared with practiced grace. "Tell me more about yourself, dear," she said, as she settled into the chair across from me. "You said you work as a social worker?" "Yes, with a nonprofit in Denver. We focus on helping elderly people who have been abandoned or neglected, as well as homeless individuals and struggling families." Eleanor's eyes grew misty. "That is beautiful work. There are so many people in this world who have been forgotten by the ones who should have cared for them." She spoke with such emotion that I found myself asking, "Do you have family, Eleanor?" Her expression shifted, a shadow passing over her features. "I had a family once," she said quietly, "but greed and cruelty took them from me." I did not know what to say to that. I wanted to ask more, but the pain in her voice told me this was not a subject she wanted to explore further. Instead, I simply reached out and took her hand in mine, offering what comfort I could through that simple gesture. We sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, sipping our tea. Then Eleanor stood and walked to a small jewelry box on her bookshelf. She opened it and withdrew something that caught the light. "I want you to have this," she said, returning to place a beautiful antique locket in my palm. I looked down at it, stunned. The locket was gold delicate and clearly very old. "I could not accept this," I protested. "It looks like a family heirloom. It must be incredibly valuable." "It was my mother's," Eleanor confirmed, "and it holds painful memories for me now. But in your hands, maybe it can mean something good again. Please, you showed me kindness today when you had every reason to keep driving. Let me give you something in return." I wanted to continue refusing, but the look in her eyes stopped me. This meant something to her. Giving me this locket was not just generosity, but some kind of release. I carefully opened the locket. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph of a young couple. The woman was beautiful with delicate features and an elegant bearing. The man beside her was handsome in that classic way of old Hollywood actors. They looked deeply in love. "That was us," Eleanor said softly, "before everything changed." I looked up at her, at the years etched into her face, and tried to reconcile this elderly woman with the vibrant young bride in the photograph. Whatever had happened to her, whatever had taken her family from her, it had clearly marked her deeply. "I promise I will treasure this," I said, "and I promise I will come back to visit you." Eleanor smiled, and for a moment she looked almost young again. "I would like that very much, dear." I gave her my phone number and took hers, promising to call and check on her. Then I returned to my car, the locket clutched in my hand. I was now almost an hour behind schedule, and I had no idea how Brandon's parents would react to my tardiness. I texted Brandon as I pulled out of Eleanor's driveway. "Running late, got lost and helped someone stranded. On my way now." His response came quickly. "Hurry, my parents do not like tardiness." The coldness of that message made something uncomfortable twist in my stomach. No concern about the person I had helped. No question about whether I was okay. Just a warning about his parents' expectations. I pushed the feeling aside and focused on driving. My GPS had finally regained signal, showing me that I was only about 30 minutes from the Ashford estate. I pressed down on the accelerator, trying to make up for lost time. The locket sat on my passenger seat, glinting in the afternoon light. Something about it tugged at my memory, some familiarity I could not quite place. But I was too focused on the road and too worried about the dinner ahead to examine the feeling more closely. I had no idea that the connection between that locket and my destination would turn my entire world upside down. The Ashford estate announced itself long before I reached the main house. First came the wall, a seemingly endless stretch of aged stone that ran along the road for at least half a mile. Then came the gates, towering iron structures adorned with an elaborate letter A that stood at least 12 feet tall. A security camera tracked my approach as I pulled up to the intercom. I gave my name, and the gates swung open with a mechanical hum that seemed almost ominous. The driveway beyond was perfectly paved and lined with ancient oak trees whose branches formed a canopy overhead. I drove slowly, taking in the manicured lawns that stretched in every direction, the glimpses of formal gardens, the distant outline of what appeared to be stables. Then the mansion itself came into view, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I had known Brandon's family was wealthy. I had prepared myself for something impressive. But the Ashford estate was beyond anything I had imagined. It was a Georgian-style manor that looked like it belonged in a period drama, 3 stories of red brick and white columns rising against the blue Connecticut sky. The building seemed to stretch forever in both directions, with wings and additions that spoke of generations of expansion. Several luxury vehicles were parked in the circular driveway in front of the main entrance. I pulled my modest Honda Civic in among the Mercedes and Bentleys, painfully aware of how out of place it looked. For a moment I sat there gripping my steering wheel, trying to summon the courage to go inside. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. My hair had survived the journey reasonably well, and my makeup still looked acceptable. I straightened my dress, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the car. The front door opened before I could even reach for the bell. A man in a formal black suit stood there, his face arranged in an expression of professional neutrality that gave away nothing. I assumed he was a butler or some kind of household manager. "Miss Gabriella," he said, "you are expected. Please follow me." He did not offer to help with my overnight bag. He did not ask about my journey. He simply turned and walked into the house, leaving me to hurry after him. The interior of the mansion was even more overwhelming than the exterior. The foyer alone was larger than my entire apartment, with marble floors that reflected the light from an enormous crystal chandelier overhead. Paintings that looked like museum pieces lined the walls. A grand staircase swept upward to the second floor, its banister gleaming with fresh polish. I barely had time to take any of this in before Brandon appeared. He emerged from a doorway to my left, looking immaculate in a suit I had never seen before. His smile was broad, but something in his eyes looked strained. "Gabriella." He came forward to embrace me, but the hug felt stiff formal. "You are here." He pulled back and his eyes swept over me, evaluating. "You look nice," he said, but the word nice carried an undertone of not quite good enough. "I am so sorry I am late." I began wanting to explain about Eleanor and the broken-down car and the lost GPS signal. But Brandon cut me off. "You stopped to help a stranger. Gabriella, this dinner was supposed to be perfect. My parents have been waiting. My father is already in a mood." I stared at him, hurt by his reaction. I had expected concern, maybe curiosity about the person I had helped. Instead, all he cared about was his parents' opinion. "I told you in my text," I said quietly. "There was an elderly woman stranded on the road. I could not just leave her there." Brandon sighed, a sound that seemed to dismiss everything I had just said. "Well, what is done is done. Come on." "They are in the sitting room." He took my arm and led me through the house. I caught glimpses of more opulent rooms as we passed a formal dining room with a table that could seat at least 20, a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, what appeared to be a music room with a grand piano gleaming in the corner. Everywhere I looked, there were fresh flowers, expensive artwork, evidence of wealth that had accumulated over generations. Finally, we reached a set of double doors. Brandon paused, straightening his tie. "Just be pleasant," he murmured to me. "And try not to mention your work too much. They already know what you do." What was that supposed to mean? Before I could ask, he pushed open the doors and led me inside. The sitting room was decorated in shades of cream and gold, with antique furniture arranged around a large fireplace. 2 people stood near the windows, turning as we entered. Even at first glance, I could see where Brandon got his looks. Both of his parents were striking, polished, and completely intimidating. Richard Ashford was tall, with silver hair swept back from a face that might have been handsome, if not for its cold expression. His eyes were a pale blue that seemed to look right through me as we were introduced. He shook my hand briefly, his grip firm but dismissive. "So you are the girl Brandon has been hiding from us," he said, and there was no warmth in his voice at all. Victoria Ashford was elegant in the way that wealthy women of a certain age often are preserved by expensive treatments and careful maintenance. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, her dress obviously designer. But her smile, when she offered it, did not reach her eyes. "You are quite late, dear," she said, her tone conveying disapproval, despite the superficially polite words. We do not tolerate tardiness in this family. I apologize, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. My GPS lost signal, and I got lost. Then I came across an elderly woman whose car had broken down, and I stopped to help her. Richard and Victoria exchanged a look that I could not interpret. Victoria's smile became even more fixed. You stopped for a stranger on the road. How quaint. Richard took a step closer, studying me like I was an interesting specimen under a microscope. Brandon mentioned that you work with the homeless and elderly. Admirable work, I suppose, though not very lucrative. The dig at my career was not even subtle. I felt my face flush but tried to maintain my composure. The work is meaningful to me. Money is not everything. The silence that followed that statement was deafening. I had obviously said the wrong thing. Richard's expression hardened slightly, and Victoria let out a small laugh that was not amused at all. What an interesting perspective, Victoria said finally. Come, dear. Let me show you around the house before dinner. We have some time before the other guests arrive. Other guests Brandon had not mentioned anyone else would be there. But I simply nodded and followed Victoria as she began what she called a tour of the main house. In reality, it felt more like an exhibition of wealth designed to make me feel as small as possible. Victoria led me from room to room, pointing out the provenance of every painting, the history of every piece of furniture, the value of every antique. Everything you see has been in the Ashford family for generations, she said at least a dozen times. We take our heritage very seriously. We passed through a hallway lined with family portraits, and I found myself studying them as we walked. They depicted Ashfords going back centuries, men and women in formal attire staring out at me with expressions that ranged from haughty to severe. Then I noticed something odd. One portrait had been removed. There was a rectangular space on the wall where the paint was lighter, clearly showing where a frame had once hung. The gap was impossible to miss. What happened there, I asked, gesturing toward the empty space. Victoria's step faltered for just a moment before she recovered. That piece was damaged, she said quickly. We had it taken down for restoration. She immediately changed the subject, pointing out some rare porcelain in a nearby display case. But I noticed that her voice had become slightly tighter, her manner more rigid. Whatever the truth was about that missing portrait, it was not about damage and restoration. We ended the tour in the dining room where the other guests had already arrived. They were exactly the type of people I had expected, wealthy, polished, speaking in casual terms about investments and country clubs and vacation homes in the Hamptons. When Victoria introduced me, they acknowledged my presence with polite disinterest before returning to their own conversations. I found myself seated at the far end of the dinner table, as far from Brandon as possible. He was at the opposite end with his parents engaged in conversation with an older couple who were apparently major investors in Richard's company. Every time I tried to catch his eye, he was looking somewhere else. The guests near me were not interested in making small talk with a social worker from Denver. One woman dripping with diamonds asked what I did, and then visibly lost interest when I told her. Another guest made a comment that was not quite quiet enough for me to miss. This is who Brandon is marrying, a social worker. The contempt in her voice made me want to sink through the floor, or better yet, walk out the door and never look back. But I stayed telling myself that I was doing this for Brandon, that once we were married and out of his parents' orbit, things would be different. Dinner itself was an elaborate affair of multiple courses served by silent staff who moved like ghosts between the guests. The food was exquisite, but I barely tasted any of it. I was too aware of how out of place I was, too conscious of the dismissive looks and subtle snubs being directed my way. At one point, the conversation turned to the topic of family legacy. Richard dominated this discussion, speaking at length about the importance of the Ashford name and the responsibilities that came with it. The Ashfords have always valued loyalty and discretion above all else, he said, his voice carrying clearly down the length of the table. We protect our own, and we remove those who threaten our position. There was something in the way he said, "Remove that," sent a chill down my spine. Victoria nodded along with her husband's words, her expression perfectly composed, but somehow hard. I looked at Brandon, hoping for some sign that he found his parents' attitudes as disturbing as I did, but he was nodding along too seemingly in complete agreement. When someone brought up grandparents and extended family in casual conversation, I saw an opportunity to learn more about the mysterious missing portrait. "Richard," I said during a lull, "Brandon mentioned that his grandmother passed away years ago. I am sorry for your loss." The effect of my words was immediate and dramatic. Richard's face went rigid, his jaw tightening visibly. Victoria's wineglass froze halfway to her lips. Even Brandon, down at the other end of the table, looked up sharply with alarm in his eyes. "My mother passed away a long time ago," Richard said, his voice flat and hard. "It is not something we discuss." Victoria smoothly redirected the conversation to something trivial, but the damage was done. I had stumbled onto something painful, something hidden. And the way the entire family had reacted told me that whatever the truth was, it was not what they were telling the world. After dinner, we retired to the sitting room for coffee, and after-dinner drinks. I excused myself to use the restroom, grateful for a few moments alone to collect my thoughts. On my way back, I took a wrong turn in the labyrinthine hallways of the mansion and found myself lost. As I tried to retrace my steps, I heard voices coming from a room nearby. The door was slightly ajar, and I recognized Richard and Victoria speaking in low, intense tones. I knew I should not eavesdrop. I knew it was wrong. But something compelled me to move closer to listen. "Cannot believe Brandon brought someone like her here," Victoria was saying, her voice dripping with disdain. "A social worker, working with homeless people and old people." What was he thinking? Richard's response was equally dismissive. "She is not suitable for this family. Did you see how she looked at everything, like a child in a candy store? She does not understand our world. What are we going to do about this relationship?" Victoria asked. "We cannot allow this to continue." "Do not worry," Richard said, and his voice carried a cold certainty that made my blood run cold. "We will handle it. We always do." I stepped back from the door, my heart pounding so hard I was certain they would hear it. They were talking about ending my relationship with Brandon. They were planning to remove me, just like Richard had talked about at dinner. I forced myself to walk calmly back to the sitting room, though my legs felt like jelly. I smiled and made small talk with the other guests, pretending that nothing was wrong. But inside my mind was racing. What had I gotten myself into? And more importantly, who were these people I was about to join my life with? That night I barely slept. Richard had announced that I would stay in the guest wing rather than drive back to my hotel in the darkness. It was not phrased as an invitation, but as a decree, and Brandon agreed without even glancing in my direction to see if that was what I wanted. So I found myself in an opulent bedroom that felt more like a gilded cage than a welcoming space. The room was beautiful by any objective standard. The bed was enormous, with linens that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Fresh flowers sat on the dresser. The ensuite bathroom was stocked with high-end toiletries. But despite all the luxury, I felt cold and uncomfortable. I lay in the darkness, replaying the events of the day. The dismissive way Richard and Victoria had treated me. The subtle and not-so-subtle insults from the other guests. Brandon's failure to defend me or even acknowledge that his parents' behavior was unacceptable. And that overheard conversation, the clinical way they had discussed removing me from Brandon's life like I was a business problem to be solved. Around midnight, I gave up on sleep entirely. My mind was too active, too troubled. I needed to move to do something other than lie there and spiral into anxiety. I got out of bed and pulled on the cardigan I had packed over my nightgown. The hallway outside my room was dimly lit and completely silent. I had no destination in mind. I just needed to walk. The mansion was different at night. During the day, with staff bustling about and the noise of the dinner party, it had felt merely intimidating. Now in the silence and shadows, it felt almost sinister. My footsteps echoed on the marble floors as I wandered through corridors I did not recognize. I found myself in front of a closed door that I did not remember from Victoria's tour. It was slightly ajar, and something about it drew me forward. I pushed it open and found myself in a library. The room was magnificent, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves covering every wall. A rolling ladder allowed access to the highest shelves. Comfortable reading chairs were arranged near a cold fireplace. It was the kind of room I had dreamed about as a child, a book lover's paradise. I knew I should not be here. Richard had made it clear at breakfast that certain areas of the house were private, but my curiosity was too strong, my need to understand this family too pressing. I stepped inside and began to look around. The books were a mix of leather-bound classics and more modern volumes. Business texts sat alongside literary novels. But what caught my attention was a shelf near the back of the room that held not books, but photo albums. Old albums, their covers worn with age. I hesitated for only a moment before pulling one down and opening it. The photographs inside told the story of the Ashford family through the decades. Richard as a young man, handsome and smiling in a way I had not seen from him today. Victoria on their wedding day, beautiful in white. The mansion during different seasons, different eras. Various family events and celebrations captured in faded color. And then I turned a page and my breath stopped completely. There was a photograph of a young Richard standing with his parents. His father was a stern-looking man in a dark suit. But it was Richard's mother who made me feel like the floor had dropped away beneath me. I knew that face. I had seen it just hours ago. With trembling hands, I pulled the locket from where I had placed it in my cardigan pocket. Eleanor had given it to me, the elderly woman I had helped on the road. I opened it and looked at the photograph inside. It was the same woman, the same delicate features, the same elegant bearing, the same gentle smile. Eleanor was Richard's mother. Eleanor was Brandon's grandmother. The grandmother that Brandon had told me was dead. I sat down heavily in the nearest chair, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Eleanor was alive. She was living in a tiny cottage less than an hour from this massive estate, while her son lived in unimaginable luxury. And her entire family had apparently erased her from their lives, told the world she was dead. Why? What could possibly explain this? I began looking through more albums, searching for answers. The photographs told a story of a loving family. There were pictures of Eleanor holding baby Richard, beaming with maternal pride. Pictures of Richard as a child running through the very gardens I had seen outside. Pictures of birthday parties and holidays and ordinary family moments. But about 20 years ago, the pictures stopped. Not just fewer pictures of Eleanor, but no pictures at all. I found pages in one album that had been torn out, ragged edges still visible where photographs had been removed. Someone had deliberately erased Eleanor from the family history. I noticed a drawer in a nearby desk and pulled it open. Inside were documents, legal papers, correspondence. I knew I was violating every boundary of privacy, but I did not care anymore. I needed to understand. The documents were dense with legal language, but certain phrases jumped out at me. Last will and testament of William Ashford. Contest of inheritance. Petition for conservatorship. Mental capacity evaluation. The picture that emerged was horrifying. When William Ashford, Richard's father, had died, his will had apparently left half of the estate to his wife Eleanor. But Richard had contested the will. He had hired lawyers and doctors who claimed that Eleanor was mentally unfit to manage her own affairs. He had petitioned for control of her assets, for the right to make decisions on her behalf. And somehow, through legal manipulation and apparent fraud, he had succeeded. He had taken everything that should have belonged to his mother and claimed it for himself. He had kicked her out of her own home. And then he had told everyone that she was dead, erasing her existence so completely that his own son believed the lie. I sat surrounded by evidence of a family's darkest secret, and I felt sick to my stomach. The man who had raised Brandon, the man I had been prepared to call father-in-law, was a monster. He had destroyed his own mother for money, and Brandon knew. Martha's words came back to me suddenly. Martha was the elderly housekeeper I had seen briefly during the tour, working quietly in a back hallway. At the time, I had not thought much of it. But now I remembered the way she had looked at me when Victoria mentioned my work with the elderly. There had been something in her eyes, recognition perhaps, or sympathy. I needed to talk to Martha. I carefully replaced everything I had disturbed and left the library. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky outside the windows in shades of pink and gold. Soon the household would wake, and I would have to pretend that everything was normal. But nothing would ever be normal again. Breakfast was served in a small morning room off the main dining hall. Richard was already there when I arrived, reading a newspaper and drinking coffee. He acknowledged me with the barest nod before returning to his reading. Victoria swept in moments later, perfectly styled, despite the early hour. "Good morning, dear," she said with that same false warmth. "I trust you slept well." I lied and said that I had. Brandon appeared shortly after, looking tired but polished. He kissed my cheek briefly before sitting down to pile his plate with food from the sideboard. As we ate, the conversation turned to wedding plans. Victoria began outlining her ideas for the ceremony, the venue she preferred, the guest list she envisioned. She spoke as though my opinions were irrelevant, as though this was her wedding to plan rather than mine. I let her talk, barely responding. My mind was elsewhere, thinking about Eleanor, about the documents in the library, about the lie this entire family was built upon. When there was a pause in Victoria's monologue, I decided to test the waters. I noticed some beautiful old photographs in the library last night, I said casually. Your family history is fascinating, Richard. The effect was immediate. Richard's newspaper lowered slowly. Victoria's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. Brandon looked up sharply from his eggs. You were in the library? Richard asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I could not sleep, I said, keeping my tone innocent. I hope that was okay. I did not touch anything, just looked at some of the books. The library is private, Richard said, and now there was no mistaking the threat in his voice. I would appreciate it if you did not wander around our home unaccompanied in the future. Victoria smoothly changed the subject, but the damage was done. They knew I had been somewhere I should not have been. Whether they suspected what I had found, I could not tell, but the tension in the room had shifted, becoming something sharper and more dangerous. After breakfast, I excused myself, claiming I wanted to explore the gardens. But instead of going outside, I made my way to the servants' areas of the house, searching for Martha. I found her in a small room off the kitchen folding linens. She looked up when I entered, her expression guarded but not unfriendly. Can I help you, miss? I closed the door behind me and approached her slowly. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Martha's hands stilled on the fabric she was folding. What kind of question? Yesterday on my way here, I helped an elderly woman whose car had broken down. Her name was Eleanor. She was small, with white hair, and she lived in a little cottage with a beautiful garden. I watched Martha's face as I spoke. Her expression shifted from wariness to recognition to something that looked almost like pain. That sounds like Mrs. Eleanor, she said quietly. The real Mrs. Ashford. My heart was pounding. What do you mean, the real Mrs. Ashford? Martha looked around nervously, as though the walls themselves might be listening. Then she moved closer to me and began to speak in a low voice. I have worked for this family for 40 years, miss. I was here when Mr. William was still alive, when Richard was just a young man. I remember when Mrs. Eleanor was the lady of this house. What happened to her? Martha's face crumpled with old grief. When Mr. William died 20 years ago, his will left half of everything to Mrs. Eleanor. The estate, the money, the investments, everything was supposed to be split between her and Richard. But Richard wanted it all. She told me about lawyers and false medical evaluations, about documents that claimed Eleanor was mentally incompetent when she was perfectly sound of mind. She told me about Victoria's role in supporting every lie, about how together they had systematically stripped Eleanor of everything she had. They kicked her out, miss. Her own son kicked her out of her home and took everything that belonged to her. And then they told everyone she was dead so that no one would ask questions. But Brandon, I whispered. Does he know? Martha's expression grew even sadder. Master Brandon was raised to believe his grandmother had passed, but he found out the truth a few years ago. One of his friends mentioned meeting an elderly woman who claimed to be his grandmother, and Brandon confronted his parents. And they told him everything, the whole ugly story. They said Mrs. Eleanor was a threat to the family's reputation, that what they had done was necessary to protect the estate. What did Brandon do? Martha looked at me with something like pity. Nothing, miss. He did nothing. He chose to keep their secret because if he spoke up, he would lose his inheritance. He chose money over his own grandmother. The words hit me like physical blows. Brandon had known for years that his grandmother was alive, abandoned, living in poverty, while he enjoyed the wealth that had been stolen from her. And he had said nothing, done nothing. He had chosen to be complicit in his parents' cruelty. I thanked Martha for her honesty and left the servants' quarters. My mind was made up. I could not marry into this family. I could not spend my life with a man who would choose money over morality, who would let his own grandmother suffer to protect his inheritance. But first, I needed to confront them, All of them. I found Brandon alone in the garden, walking among the rose bushes with his phone in his hand. He looked up when he heard my footsteps on the gravel path, and his face arranged itself into a smile that now seemed completely hollow. "There you are," he said. "My mother was asking about you. She wants to discuss centerpiece options for the wedding." "There is not going to be a wedding." The words came out flat and final. Brandon's smile faltered confusion, replacing the smooth charm. "What, Gabriella? What are you talking about?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out the locket. "Do you know what this is?" His face went pale the moment he saw it. "Where did you get that?" "From the woman I helped yesterday. Her name is Eleanor. She is your grandmother, the one you told me was dead." Brandon said nothing. He just stared at the locket as though it were a snake that might strike at any moment. "I know everything," I continued. "I found the documents in the library. I talked to Martha. I know what your father did to Eleanor, how he stole her inheritance and kicked her out of her own home. And I know that you have known the truth for years and did nothing." Brandon finally found his voice. "I can explain," he started, but I cut him off. "Explain what?" "That your father committed fraud against his own mother, that you found out about it and chose to stay silent because you did not want to lose your precious inheritance. You do not understand our family," Brandon said, his voice taking on a defensive edge. "It is complicated. My grandmother was not well. My father did what he thought was best. That is a lie, and you know it. I met Eleanor. She is sharp and kind and perfectly capable. Your father did not act out of concern for her. He acted out of greed." Brandon's expression hardened. "Fine. You want the truth?" "Yes, my father took the estate. Yes, my grandmother is alive. But that was 20 years ago. Nothing can be changed now. Nothing can be changed. You could have helped her, Brandon. You could have told me the truth from the beginning. Instead, you lied about your own grandmother being dead and risked my inheritance. Do you have any idea how much money we are talking about? Tens of millions of dollars, Gabriella." I was not going to throw that away. I felt physically ill. The man I had loved, the man I had agreed to marry, was standing in front of me, essentially admitting that money mattered more to him than his own grandmother, more than basic human decency, more than me. "Even for your own grandmother," I asked quietly, "you would let her live in poverty and obscurity to protect your bank account?" Brandon hesitated for just a moment, and in that hesitation I saw who he truly was. "She is old," he said finally. "She will not live much longer anyway. Why should I sacrifice my future for someone who will be gone in a few years?" The words hung in the air between us, ugly and undeniable. "I cannot believe I was going to marry you," I said. "I cannot believe I thought you were a good person." Panic flickered across Brandon's face. "Gabriella, wait. Think about this. Think about our future, the life we could have together, the money, the status, the security, a life built on cruelty and lies." I shook my head. "No, thank you." Something shifted in Brandon's expression, then the charm falling away to reveal something harder and more dangerous underneath. He stepped closer to me, his hand closing around my arm with a grip that bordered on painful. "You cannot tell anyone about this. My family will destroy you. Let go of me. I am serious, Gabriella. You do not want to make enemies of the Ashfords. We have resources you cannot even imagine. We could ruin your career, your reputation, your entire life." I wrenched my arm free and stepped back. "I already have an enemy, Brandon. I am looking at him." I turned and walked toward the house, my heart pounding, but my resolve clear. Behind me, I could hear Brandon calling my name, alternating between threats and pleas. I ignored all of it. I found Richard and Victoria in the formal living room, entertaining the few guests who had stayed overnight. They looked up as I entered, polite smiles fixed in place. "Ah, Gabriella," Victoria said. "We were just discussing the engagement party. I was thinking we could host it here in the fall, perhaps September, when the gardens are at their peak." "There is not going to be an engagement party," I said clearly. "There is not going to be a wedding." The smiles froze. The other guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something dramatic was about to unfold. Richard stood slowly, his expression darkening. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately." "No," I said. "I think we should discuss this right here. I think everyone should know what kind of family the Ashfords really are. What followed was the most difficult thing I have ever done. I laid out everything, finding Eleanor on the road, recognizing her from the photographs in the library, the documents I had discovered. What Martha had told me, 20 years of lies and theft and cruelty. Richard and Victoria denied everything, of course. Richard called me confused and unstable. Victoria suggested I was suffering from some kind of mental breakdown. They tried to spin a narrative in which I was the villain, a gold digger who had invented these accusations because they had discovered my true nature. But I had the locket. I held it up for everyone to see the photograph inside, clearly showing Eleanor as a young woman. This belonged to Eleanor Ashford, I said, Richard's mother. The woman this family claims is dead, but who is actually living in a tiny cottage an hour from here, abandoned by her own son because he wanted her inheritance. The other guests were clearly uncomfortable, uncertain who to believe, but I did not care about convincing them. I only cared about saying what needed to be said. You stole from your own mother, I said directly to Richard. You committed fraud, hired corrupt doctors to claim she was incompetent and kicked her out of her home. And then you told everyone she was dead so you would not have to answer questions. Richard's face had gone a dangerous shade of red. These are serious accusations, young lady. You have no proof. I have the documents from your library. I have testimony from your own staff. And I have Eleanor herself alive and well and ready to tell her story. Brandon had followed me inside by this point. He stood in the doorway looking between his parents and me with an expression of anguish. This is your last chance, I said to him. Stand up for your grandmother. Stand up for what is right. The silence stretched. Everyone was watching Brandon, waiting to see what he would do. I think you should leave Gabriella, he said finally. You are clearly not understanding our family dynamics. And there it was, the final betrayal. The man I had loved choosing his parents' money over truth, over justice, over me. I feel sorry for you, Brandon, I said quietly. You had a chance to be better than them. You chose not to be. I slipped the engagement ring off my finger and placed it on the nearest table. Then I walked toward the door. Victoria called after me, her voice sharp with fury. You will regret this. No one rejects the Ashfords without consequences. I turned back one last time. The only regret I have is not seeing who you all really are sooner. And then I walked out of the mansion down the long driveway into the morning sunlight. My hands were shaking and tears were streaming down my face, but beneath the pain I felt something unexpected. Freedom. I did not go home. Instead, I drove directly to Eleanor's cottage. She answered the door looking surprised but pleased to see me. My dear, what happened? You look like you have been crying. I have been. And I have something to tell you. I told her everything. About meeting Brandon 2 years ago, about the engagement, about being invited to meet his family, about recognizing her from the photographs in the mansion, about the documents I had found, and the truth I had uncovered. Eleanor listened in silence, her expression cycling through shock, pain, and finally a deep, weary sadness. I knew one day the truth would come out, she said when I finished. I just never imagined it would be like this. Tears were flowing freely down her wrinkled cheeks, and I took her hands in mine, offering what comfort I could. My son, she whispered. My Richie. I still remember when he was a little boy. He used to bring me flowers from the garden every morning. He would climb into my lap and tell me he loved me more than anything in the world. She shook her head slowly. How did he become this person? What did I do wrong? You did nothing wrong, I said firmly. He made his choices. He is responsible for them, not you. Over the next hour, Eleanor told me the full story of what had happened 20 years ago. She told me about her husband William's death and the grief that followed, about Richard's transformation from loving son to cold stranger, influenced by Victoria's ambition, about the lawyers who showed up with papers she did not understand, the doctors who declared her incompetent without ever properly examining her. I fought, she said. I tried to get my own lawyers, but I could not afford the ones who might have actually helped. Richard had frozen all my accounts by then, claimed he was managing them for my own good. By the time the courts finished with me, I had nothing, not even the right to live in my own home. The injustice of it made my blood boil. How could anyone do this to their own mother? I thought about Brandon often. Eleanor continued. My grandson. I never got to watch him grow up, never got to know him as a man. She looked at me with infinite sadness. And now you tell me he knows the truth and chose to ignore it. That hurts more than anything Richard ever did. I tightened my grip on her hands. "I am going to help you, Eleanor. This is not over." She shook her head. "Dear, you have already given up so much. Your engagement, your future with Brandon. I cannot ask you to sacrifice anything more. You are not asking. I am offering." And honestly, walking away from Brandon was not a sacrifice. It was an escape. Over the next several days, I threw myself into finding justice for Eleanor. Through my work at the nonprofit, I had connections with various advocacy organizations and legal aid societies. I reached out to everyone I knew, explaining the situation and asking for help. An elder law attorney named Susan agreed to take Eleanor's case pro bono after hearing the details. She was outraged by what Richard had done and confident that there was a strong legal case to be made. The original will clearly stated that Eleanor should receive half the estate plus lifetime right to live in the family home, Susan explained, after reviewing the documents I had managed to photograph in the library. The mental capacity evaluation that was used to strip her of her rights shows clear signs of irregularity. We can argue fraud, elder abuse, possibly even criminal charges. Martha, the housekeeper, who had worked for the Ashfords for 40 years, agreed to provide a statement. She was terrified of the family's power, but her conscience could no longer bear the weight of their secrets. "Mrs. Eleanor was always kind to me," Martha said, when we met to discuss her testimony. "When my mother was sick, she gave me paid leave for 3 months to care for her. She does not deserve what they did to her. No one does." With Martha's testimony, Eleanor's account, and the documentary evidence, the case began to take shape. Susan advised us that going to the media might help put pressure on the Ashfords, who relied heavily on their reputation in business and social circles. The story broke first in local Connecticut news. Wealthy family accused of defrauding elderly matriarch. It spread from there to larger outlets picked up by news organizations who recognized a compelling narrative of greed and betrayal. The Ashfords responded exactly as I had expected. Richard issued a statement calling Eleanor troubled and confused, and me a vindictive ex-girlfriend seeking revenge. Victoria gave tearful interviews about how their family was being persecuted by lies. But public opinion was turning against them. Comment sections overflowed with support for Eleanor and condemnation of Richard. Old friends of Eleanor's people who had lost touch with her after Richard told everyone she was dead began coming forward. They shared memories of the woman she had been, the kindness she had shown, the impossibility that she could have been the mentally incompetent person Richard's lawyers had described. A month after I walked out of the Ashford mansion, Richard's legal team reached out with a settlement offer. It was substantial. Eleanor would receive a significant portion of the estate that should have been hers all along. Richard would issue a public apology, acknowledging that mistakes had been made in how Eleanor's affairs were handled. He would pay all her legal fees, plus compensatory damages for years of hardship. "Is it enough?" I asked Eleanor when Susan presented the offer. Eleanor considered for a long moment. "It is not about the money," she said finally. "It never was. It was about being acknowledged, about having my truth heard after 20 years of being erased." She looked at me with tears in her eyes. "And thanks to you, that has happened. Whatever happens with the settlement, I have already won." Eleanor accepted the offer. In the aftermath of the settlement, something unexpected began to happen. Extended family members, cousins and nieces and nephews who had been told Eleanor was dead, started reaching out to her. They were horrified by what Richard had done, ashamed that they had believed his lies for so long. A small gathering was held at Eleanor's cottage, the first time in 20 years that she had been surrounded by family who actually cared about her. I was there too, no longer a stranger who had stopped to help on a country road, but someone Eleanor introduced as my granddaughter of the heart. Brandon tried to contact me several times during those weeks. His messages ranged from angry accusations to pathetic pleas. He blamed me for destroying his family. He begged me to reconsider. He claimed he had always planned to help Eleanor eventually, that I had not given him enough time. "Have you gone to see your grandmother yet?" I asked him during the one phone call I actually answered. His silence told me everything I needed to know. I thought so. I hung up and blocked his number. I learned through the news that the Ashford family continued to unravel in the months following the settlement. Richard's business reputation was badly damaged. Clients questioned whether they could trust a man who would defraud his own mother. Victoria filed for divorce, reportedly claiming that she had not known the full extent of what Richard had done, though no one who knew the family believed her. Brandon was rumored to have moved to another city, attempting to escape the shadow of his family's disgrace. I felt no satisfaction at his downfall, only sadness for the person I had thought he was, and the life I had thought we would have together. But mostly, I felt grateful. Grateful that I had stopped for Eleanor that day on the road. Grateful that her locket had led me to the truth. Grateful that I had walked away from the Ashfords before I became part of their world of cruelty and lies. 6 months have passed since that pivotal day when I got lost on a country road in Connecticut. My life has changed in ways I never could have anticipated. I still work at the nonprofit, but I was promoted to Director of Elder Services after Eleanor's case brought attention to our work. Her story inspired a new program focused specifically on elder rights and advocacy, helping identify and support seniors who are being exploited or abused by their own families. Eleanor moved out of her tiny cottage and into a comfortable home where she can afford proper care. I visit her every week, and our time together has become one of the things I look forward to most. We cook dinner together, tend to her garden, and talk for hours about everything and nothing. She tells me stories about her life before Richard's betrayal about her husband William, and the love they shared about the dreams she had for her family that never came to be. She has become the grandmother I never had. The heartbreak over Brandon took time to heal. There were nights when I lay awake wondering what might have been if things had been different, if he had been the person I thought he was. But clarity came gradually. I was not mourning Brandon. I was mourning the illusion of Brandon, the man I had invented in my mind, who bore little resemblance to the person he actually was. I learned to trust my instincts again. That feeling I had in my gut, when his parents dismissed me, when Brandon failed to defend me, when the conversations at dinner felt more like tests than getting to know each other, that feeling was my intuition trying to warn me. I had ignored it for too long. I will not make that mistake again. I am not dating yet, but I am open to the possibility of love in the future. What I know now is what I will not accept lies cowardice, the willingness to hurt others for personal gain. I know what I need in a partner: honesty, integrity, compassion. Someone who would stop for a stranger on the road, not because there was anything to gain, but simply because it was the right thing to do. Eleanor and I were sitting on her porch recently watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. She was wearing the locket again. I had returned it to her, believing it belonged with her. "I never thought I would wear this again," she said, touching it gently. It reminded me too much of what I had lost. And now I asked. Now it reminds me of what I found. A granddaughter. Maybe not by blood, but certainly by heart. I reached over and took her hand. "You saved me too, Eleanor. You showed me who I was about to marry. You showed me the truth before it was too late." "Sometimes God puts the right people in our path at exactly the right moment," she said with a smile. "Or perhaps you put yourself in mine. You could have kept driving that day. You were late, you were stressed, you had somewhere important to be, but you stopped anyway." I thought about that decision often. What if I had ignored my instincts and kept driving? What if I had prioritized being on time to impress people who did not deserve my respect? What if I had let the voice telling me I was too busy drown out the voice telling me that kindness mattered more than punctuality? I would have married Brandon. I would have joined a family built on cruelty and lies. I would have spent my life surrounded by wealth, but never knowing the truth. And Eleanor would have remained erased, forgotten, denied justice. One decision changed everything. I have been writing in a journal lately, trying to process all that happened and what I learned from it. Last night I wrote something that felt important. I used to think love meant finding someone who swept you off your feet with grand gestures and promises of perfect futures. Brandon did all of that. The fancy restaurants, the expensive gifts, the dream of a wealthy life. But real love is not about what someone gives you. It is about what they are willing to sacrifice. Brandon was not willing to sacrifice anything for anyone. Not for me, not even for his own grandmother. Eleanor taught me that kindness is never wasted. The few hours I spent helping her changed my entire life. I have been speaking at conferences lately about elder rights and abuse awareness, sharing Eleanor's story with her permission to help others recognize the warning signs. After one such event, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "My mother-in-law is being treated terribly by my husband's brother," she said. "He controls all her money limits. Who she can see threatens her constantly. She is afraid, and I did not know what to do. But after hearing your talk, I know I have to act. I have to help her." That conversation stayed with me for days. One person's story reaching another person who can then help someone else. Ripples spreading outward from a single act of kindness on a lonely road. If you are watching this right now, I want to share what I learned from all of this. Trust your instincts. That voice inside that tells you something is wrong is usually right. I ignored red flags with Brandon for 2 years because I wanted so badly for him to be who I thought he was. Never again will I silence my own wisdom to preserve an illusion. Wealth does not equal worth. The richest family I ever met was also the cruelest. Eleanor, with almost nothing, had more grace and dignity than all the Ashfords combined. Judge people by how they treat those who cannot benefit them, not by the size of their bank accounts. The truth always surfaces. It might take time, but lies cannot stay hidden forever. Richard spent 20 years pretending his mother was dead. One chance encounter on a country road exposed everything. Family is who you choose, not just who you are born to. Eleanor is more my grandmother now than any blood relative of the Ashfords ever could have been. The people who love you, who stand by you, who show up for you. Those are your true family regardless of DNA. And finally, never be too busy or too important to help a stranger. You never know whose life you might change, including your own. Sometimes the wrong turn leads you exactly where you need to be. I got lost that day looking for a mansion. Instead, I found something more valuable than any estate. I found truth, I found purpose, I found family, and I found myself. Have you ever helped a stranger and discovered something unexpected? Have you ever had a moment where one small decision changed the entire course of your life? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. There are so many Eleanors in the world, so many people who have been forgotten or discarded by those who should have protected them. Maybe by sharing these stories we can help them too. Please subscribe for more stories about truth, courage, and choosing kindness over convenience. And if you found value in this, share it with your friends and family so they can hear it too. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for being the kind of person who listens to stories like this, who cares about justice and kindness and doing the right thing. Remember, the next stranger you help could change your life forever, or you might change theirs. Take care of yourselves and each other, and never stop being kind.